So I'm going to admit something to you this morning, that I used to be, not anymore, but I used to be kind of creepy. And in what way, you're probably wondering? Well, I used to be a cat person, and I still like cats, but I'm not talking about like one cat or two cats or three cats. My family, we used to have 6 cats, and so that's the first time where I felt like I can remember something seeming really unfair in my life. And that's because in the summertime when I was a kid, my sister and I, well, my older sisters and I, we would get babysat by our older cousin. And so we had a pregnant cat at the time, and I was just so excited because she was going to have the kitten soon. And then one day we were watching The Little Mermaid, and the cat just hadn't been around the house, and we're like, where is she? And so we went upstairs, and the mama cat had given birth in my sister's closet to the kittens. And I was so upset. I was crushed. I was heartbroken because my older sister was bragging, and she was just so excited. Like, she's a couple years older than me, but she's even crazier about cats than I am. So she was ecstatic, and I was like crying because the cats weren't born in my room, and I didn't feel special, and I got in trouble because, you know, I was just so upset. My sister was like pushing me out of her room because she's like, no, the cats are mine. And so that's the first time I really remember something seeming unfair in my life. And I think we all have some kind of story, or we've been in some kind of circumstance where we felt like something's been unfair. And for instance, maybe we're like in a job situation. Maybe we feel like our boss has been unfair to us, or maybe we feel like our coworkers aren't being fair. And at school, we see it with like the student body. We complain to the administration because we think that they're not being fair. And even in our homes, like I said, for example, like I felt things were unfair because my sister, you know, the cats were born in my sister's closet. And I noticed that a lot of times when we're in community with other people, there's the opportunity or the possibility where things just might not seem fair. People may be taken advantage of. There's just a lot of problems when it comes to community. And community is a good thing to be in, but you know, there's always that possibility of having some kind of conflict. So we can also see problems in just a larger scale, which is like the global situation. We know from like human trafficking is a big case of injustice in our world, and we have like child soldiers and things like that. I have this little book that I got a couple years ago, but it's really interesting because it has like a lot of stories, like all these have stories of like cases of injustice and just things, and it's really hard to look at. Like I couldn't even look at it the first time because there's pictures in there, and it just shows how just the various unjust acts that are happening in our world. And so some questions is, how do we respond to being treated unfairly or seeing just acts of injustice? How do we respond? There are a couple ways that we might respond, and we might respond by getting angry. We might respond by, you know, pitying ourselves, you know, and maybe just complaining and whining. I know growing up for me, when things were unfair, when I felt like things were unfair, I whined and I complained. And my mom used to always say to me, she used to say, no, what does complaining do? Does that change the situation? And, you know, whining about a lot of things, it doesn't change the situation. It just, you know, you're still stuck in that same place, and action is really what changes, you know, the situation. So we're going to look at the story of Nehemiah today, Nehemiah chapter 5. And that's the story of some problems with fairness in the community. So we're going to look at that text. So if you flip to Nehemiah 5, we're going to look at verses 1 through 13. So I'll give you some background to the text. So Nehemiah had been cupbearer to the king of Persia, but his people were the Jews, and they had just been allowed to return after exile. And so their city had been ruined, and they needed a lot of reconstruction. And so Nehemiah pleaded with the king and asked him if he could be able to return to the land to help rebuild and reconstruct. And it meant a lot to Nehemiah. He cared and he had compassion, and he felt really burdened for the people. And that's really why he wanted to return. And so he was allowed by the king to return, and so he went, and he was going to start this building project. Now, I was thinking about just how much it would cost to do a rebuilding project, and I thought about Like in my own life, a couple years ago, my family, we did a ton of remodeling on our house. I know that that cost a lot of money. And I was looking up some statistics, and in 2008, the U.S. Census Bureau, they reported that over $300 million were spent building projects such as like bridges and schools and roads. So that's a lot of money, and that's something that was going on with the Jewish people. And so they said in verse 5, not verse 5, but the first verse, it says that the men and their wives raised a great outcry against their Jewish brothers. Some were saying, "We and our sons and daughters are numerous. In order for us to eat and stay alive, we must get grain." Others were saying, "We are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our homes to get grain during the famine." So on top of this big building project, which we know is going to cost a lot of money, there was a famine, and there was already a general need in the city and among the people. And I was thinking about how, like, after natural disasters, the land just needs completely fixing up, and that obviously costs a lot of money. When people come together as a community, we see that from examples like Hurricane Katrina. There was lots of rebuilding that needed to be done. Lots of houses got wiped away, and but the community came together, not just like their community, not just the people down there, but they got help from all over the place. But it really brings the community together, and that was what was happening with Nehemiah. All the Jewish people, they were coming together. They wanted to help rebuild the walls. So, but there were problems, and that was with the taxation that was going on. And there were a couple groups of people that were struggling financially because of this. And there were people that were going into complete destitute. They had absolutely no resources anymore. They could barely pay the taxes, and in order to pay the taxes, they had to often sell their children into slavery. And that's kind of like today how we have the human trafficking, and we see people in third world countries or poorer countries who feel like they have no other option but to sell their children in hopes to make life better for them. And so that was kind of what was happening with the story of Nehemiah, that children were getting sold as well. Then there were people that did have land, but they were slowly losing it because they were having to pay taxes on their land as well as taxes on the walls. And this was creating a lot of problems. It was creating problems in the sense that, like I said, people were being financially taken advantage of by the officials and the authorities and the people collecting the taxes, but they were also being, like how I was saying, how the children were being sold into slavery. If we look at the footnotes, or we look a little bit deeper into the meaning of that, it's actually sexually abused and connotations of that nature. But there was also becoming disunity among the community as the Jewish people, between the Jewish people. For instance, there's a Jewish law that said that they weren't allowed to sell their slaves or to sell themselves to foreigners, to people outside the Jewish community. They weren't allowed to sell themselves to the Gentiles. Like if there was a rich Jewish person that could afford to have a slave, they were to sell themselves to that person, not to look outside of the community. But that's what they were doing. They were going to the Gentiles and they were selling themselves to them. And then in verse 9, it says, "So I continued, what you are doing is not right. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of our God to avoid the reproach of our Gentile enemies?" So what was happening was, because they were struggling, obviously. They were struggling financially, being able to, come up with this money to rebuild the walls. And they were having just trouble with unity amongst themselves. And so they were becoming a reproach to the Gentiles. They were becoming a mockery. And that obviously, it's degrading to, to be struggling and to have people from the outside, the opposition, making fun of you, or, just seeing you struggle. So that was what was going on with the Jewish people. So how did Nehemiah respond? Well, he could have just shrugged off the problems of the taxation and the people's crying, their suffering, and he could have said, well, you know what, I know that the people are having trouble, but you know what, the walls really need to get built. The walls are an important part of the city. When I think of walls, I think of little fences, sort of, but these weren't just fences of protection. These were huge, great walls that were, kept the city strong, and it was like a fortress.